The snow had started hours earlier, light and harmless at first, the kind that barely held on to the ground. By the time Jonathan Reed's SUV turned off the main road and onto the private drive, it had thickened into something heavier, quieter, the kind that swallowed sound and made even familiar places feel distant. The estate gates opened slowly, metal humming as they slid apart. The headlights cut through the dark, revealing rows of bare trees, their branches bowed under white weight. Jonathan loosened his tie and leaned back against the leather seat. It had been a long day. Too many meetings. Too many people wanting something from him. At 61, he had learned to recognize the difference between real problems and manufactured urgency. Tonight had been full of the latter. All he wanted was heat, silence, and a drink he wouldn't have to share. The SUV rolled forward at a steady pace, tires crunching against the gravel now hidden beneath snow. The house appeared ahead, its stone facade glowing softly under exterior lights. Everything looked exactly as it should. Almost. Jonathan frowned slightly and leaned forward. "Slow down," he said. The driver eased off the accelerator. The headlights swept across the side of the house, toward the service entrance that staff used. That was when Jonathan saw it. A dark shape near the low stone wall. At first, his mind refused to assign meaning to it. A fallen branch, maybe. A pile of snow blown out of place by the wind. But the longer he looked, the more wrong it felt. The shape was too compact. Too deliberate. "Stop the car," Jonathan said, sharper this time. The SUV came to a halt. Cold rushed in the moment the door opened. Jonathan stepped out without waiting, his polished shoes sinking into snow that had already soaked through the seams. The night was quiet in a way that made his ears ring. No wind. No voices. Just the faint hum of the engine behind him. As he walked closer, the shape resolved into something unmistakable. A person. A woman lay curled on her side, her back to the stone wall, knees pulled up toward her chest. Snow dusted her coat and clung to her hair. Her face was partially hidden, but her breathing was visible, thin clouds of vapor that rose and vanished too quickly. Jonathan stopped a few feet away. Something in his chest tightened. People did not end up like this on his property. Not by accident. Not unnoticed. He knelt down, the cold biting through his coat immediately. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low. "Can you hear me?" No response. He reached out, hesitated for half a second, then gently touched her shoulder. Her eyes flew open. She gasped sharply and tried to scramble backward, hands slipping against the snow. Panic flooded her face so fast it was almost physical. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice cracked and hoarse. "I didn't mean to be here. I'll go. Please." "Hey," Jonathan said quickly. "You're not in trouble." She didn't seem to hear him. Her arms wrapped around herself, shaking violently now. Her lips were tinted blue. That's when he recognized her. Denise Carter. She'd worked in his home for years. Quiet. Efficient. The kind of person who seemed to move through rooms without disturbing them. He knew her name, knew her face, but realized with discomfort that he knew little else. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. "I didn't fall asleep," she said immediately, words tumbling over each other. "I was just waiting. I didn't want to bother anyone." "Waiting for what?" "Morning," she almost said. But she stopped herself. Jonathan glanced back toward the car. "Call an ambulance," he said to the driver, who was already stepping out, phone in hand. "And get a blanket." Denise's eyes widened. "No. No hospital. I'm fine." "You're freezing," Jonathan said. She shook her head, teeth chattering. "I just need to go." "Go where?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. She didn't answer. The driver returned with a thick wool blanket. Jonathan wrapped it around her shoulders carefully. She stiffened at the contact but didn't pull away. "You work here?" Jonathan said slowly. "Why were you outside?" Her gaze dropped to the snow-covered ground. "I was told to leave," she said. Jonathan frowned. "Who told you that?" She swallowed. "Your son." The words settled heavily between them, heavier than the snow. Jonathan straightened, his breath fogging the air. "That doesn't make sense," he said, more to himself than to her. Denise laughed softly, a sound with no humor in it. It didn't to me either. The ambulance lights appeared at the edge of the drive, red and white flashing against the snow. As the medics approached, Jonathan looked once more at the stone wall, at the place where she'd been lying. Something had already gone wrong tonight. Something he didn't yet understand. And as Denise was helped to her feet, unsteady and silent, Jonathan had the unsettling feeling that this was only the beginning. If you're still here, listening through the quiet of this night, you might want to stay close. Stories like this don't unfold all at once. And sometimes the smallest moments, noticed or ignored, change everything. You can follow along as this story continues, and if you feel like it, share where you're listening from. For now, all Jonathan knew was this. Someone had been left in the cold. And it had happened under his roof. The ambulance doors closed with a hollow thud, and the flashing lights faded down the drive, leaving the estate wrapped once again in silence. Snow continued to fall, steady and indifferent, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Jonathan Reed stood where the SUV had stopped, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, staring at the faint outline left behind in the snow. The impression of a body curled against the stone wall was already softening, edges blurring as fresh flakes filled it in. It bothered him more than he expected. He went inside, but the warmth of the house didn't settle him. The air felt too still, too controlled, like a place designed to keep discomfort out. He removed his coat, hung it carefully, then paused, realizing his hands were shaking slightly. That didn't happen often. In the kitchen, lights glowed automatically as he entered. Stainless steel surfaces reflected his face back at him. Older than he remembered, more tired. He poured himself a glass of water instead of the drink he'd wanted earlier and leaned against the counter. Denise Carter. He replayed her voice in his head. The way she'd woken in fear. Not confusion. Not embarrassment. Fear. The kind that comes from experience, not imagination. Jonathan prided himself on running a tight operation. His businesses, his household, even his personal relationships were structured to minimize surprises. Problems were identified early, handled quietly, resolved efficiently. This had slipped through everything. He walked toward the back hallway where the service entrance was located. The floor here was plainer, the decor less intentional. This was a part of the house he rarely visited, though dozens of people passed through it every week. The door was locked. That was normal for the hour. Jonathan checked the keypad and scrolled through recent access logs. His jaw tightened as he read the entries. Denied. Denied. Manual override. The override code belonged to security management. He stood there longer than necessary, listening to the faint hum of the heating system, the subtle creaks of a house settling under winter's weight. For the first time in years, the estate felt unfamiliar to him. Not hostile. Just indifferent. Like it had been keeping secrets. He returned to his office and opened his laptop. Sleep was out of the question now. He pulled up internal security footage, navigating with practiced ease. The cameras covered most areas, driveways, entrances, hallways. The service entrance camera flickered briefly as the feed loaded. Jonathan leaned closer. The timestamp showed earlier that evening. He watched Denise arrive. She stepped into frame with a small bag over her shoulder, shoulders hunched against the cold. She looked tired but unremarkable, moving the way someone does at the end of a long shift. She reached for the keypad, typed in her code. Denied. She tried again. Denied. Jonathan felt a flicker of irritation. Access issues happened, but rarely without explanation. Denise stepped back, looking around. She pulled her phone from her pocket, tapped the screen, waited. No answer. She tried again. Minutes passed. Jonathan watched as she paced, stamped her feet against the cold, rubbed her hands together. She knocked once on the door, lightly, like she didn't want to disturb anyone. No response. The footage continued. Eventually, she sat down on the low stone wall, bag at her feet. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and stared out into the dark. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. No theft. No sneaking. No urgency to escape. Just waiting. The camera didn't show what happened next. It shifted angles, focusing elsewhere, missing the moment she lay down, missing the moment exhaustion overtook her. Jonathan closed the laptop slowly. His phone buzzed on the desk. A message from hospital staff confirmed that Denise was stable, being monitored overnight. Hypothermia risk, but no lasting damage expected. Relief came, followed immediately by something heavier. Why hadn't she gone to a shelter? Why hadn't she called a friend? Why had she stayed? Jonathan stood and walked to the window overlooking the grounds. Snow covered everything now, smooth and untouched, erasing evidence as it always did. He thought of how easily people disappeared in places like this. How many lives passed quietly through his world without leaving a mark? Down the hall he heard footsteps. Gulp. Jonathan didn't turn. For a moment he considered saying nothing, letting the night pass, letting things return to their proper order. Instead he felt a question rising, one he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Behind him the footsteps stopped. And in that pause Jonathan realized something unsettling. Whatever had happened outside in the snow hadn't been an accident. It had been allowed. Jonathan didn't turn right away. He remained at the window, hands resting on the sill, watching the snow drift down in slow, steady sheets. The reflection in the glass showed his son standing a few feet behind him, posture loose, one shoulder leaned casually against the wall. "Didn't expect you home this late," Caleb said. Jonathan finally faced him. "Neither did I." Caleb smiled faintly, the expression he used when he thought charm could smooth over anything. "Rough night?" "That depends," Jonathan replied. "What did you do this evening?" Caleb's brow furrowed just enough to suggest confusion. "I went out, met some people." "Why?" Jonathan studied him. There was no nervousness, no urgency to explain. If anything, Caleb looked mildly annoyed at being questioned at all. "A woman was found outside," Jonathan said. "On the property. In the snow." Caleb's expression flickered, so fast it might have been missed by anyone not watching closely. "A woman? You know who I'm talking about." Caleb shrugged. "Staff comes and goes. You'll have to be more specific." Jonathan felt a slow burn start behind his ribs. "Denise Carter." Caleb exhaled, almost amused. "Her?" "Yes," Jonathan said. "Her?" "Well," Caleb said, pushing off the wall, "if she was outside there was probably a reason." Jonathan took a step forward. "What reason would justify locking an employee out in freezing weather?" Caleb's smile faded. "I didn't lock her out. Security logs say otherwise." Caleb's jaw tightened. "She was dismissed. That wasn't your decision to make." Caleb crossed his arms. "She was stealing." Jonathan waited. "What did she steal?" Caleb hesitated, then waved a hand dismissively. "Small things. Supplies. Probably more." "Probably," Jonathan repeated. "You didn't report it." "I handled it." "You accused her without evidence." Caleb scoffed. "You're taking her word over mine?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. He thought of Denise's eyes snapping open in fear. The way she braced herself for punishment instead of help. "I'm taking facts seriously," Jonathan said finally. Caleb laughed, sharp and incredulous. "She's a housekeeper. What facts do you think she has?" The words landed harder than Caleb seemed to realize. Jonathan felt something shift inside him, a recalibration he hadn't anticipated. "She's an employee," he said. "And she nearly died tonight." Caleb looked away. "You're exaggerating." "Am I?" Jonathan asked quietly. "Because the ambulance didn't think so." Silence stretched between them. Caleb straightened. "You're overreacting. She'll be fine. People like her always are." Jonathan's voice dropped. "You don't get to decide that." Caleb's eyes hardened. "This is my house too." "No," Jonathan said. "It's not." The words hung there, heavy and undeniable. Caleb stared at him, clearly stunned. "You're serious?" "I am." Caleb laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. "You're going to blow this up over a maid?" Jonathan flinched, not outwardly but inside. The ease with which Caleb said it told him more than any security footage ever could. "This conversation isn't over," Jonathan said. Caleb shook his head. "It shouldn't even be happening." He turned and walked away down the hall, footsteps retreating into the quiet of the house. Jonathan remained where he was long after his son disappeared. The estate felt larger now, emptier in places he hadn't noticed before. He thought of how Denise had moved through these rooms every day, unseen, unheard, until the night she was left outside them. He returned to his office and sat heavily at the desk. He pulled up Denise's employee file, attendance records, performance notes, years of quiet consistency. No disciplinary actions. No complaints. No protection either. Jonathan leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. The image of her sitting on the stone wall replayed again, clearer now. Not just waiting for warmth. Waiting for permission. Waiting for someone to notice. His phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. Denise was awake. She'd asked to speak to someone. Jonathan stared at the screen, a sense of unease settling deep in his chest. Because whatever Denise had to say next, he suspected it wouldn't be small. And it wouldn't be easy to hear. The hospital room was dim, lit mostly by the glow of monitors and a single lamp near the bed. The steady beep of a heart monitor filled the space, slow and methodical, like it was keeping time for something larger. Denise lay propped against thin white pillows, a blanket pulled up to her chest. Her skin had regained some color, but exhaustion still clung to her face. When Jonathan stepped inside, she noticed immediately. Her eyes tracked him with quiet alertness, not surprise. "You came," she said. "I said I would," Jonathan replied. He took the chair beside the bed but didn't sit right away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavier here than it had in the snow, weighed down by warmth, by safety that had arrived too late. The nurse finished checking Denise's IV and stepped out, closing the door softly behind her. "Jonathan Saturday, how are you feeling?" "Tired," Denise said. "Embarrassed." "You don't need to be." She gave a small, humorless smile. "People say that when they don't understand." Jonathan studied her hands resting on the blanket. They were steady now, but faint red marks circled her wrists where she'd clenched them too tightly against the cold. "I watched the security footage," he said. Denise's shoulders stiffened. "I saw you try the door," Jonathan continued. "I saw the access denial." She exhaled slowly as if she'd been bracing for this. "Then you know I didn't wander out there by choice." "I know," he said. She nodded once. "Good." Another pause. "You asked to speak to someone," Jonathan said. "Was it me?" "Yes." "Why?" Denise turned her head slightly, eyes drifting to the window where snow still fell outside. "Because I needed to know something before I decide what to do next." Jonathan waited. "Did you know?" she asked quietly. "Know what?" She looked back at him. How things were handled. Who had power? Who didn't? Jonathan hesitated. The honest answer was uncomfortable. "I knew how the system was supposed to work." "That's not what I asked," Denise said. Jonathan felt the question settle in his chest. "No," he admitted. "I didn't know how it actually worked." Denise absorbed that without reaction. "That makes sense." "Does it?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "People who don't need protection rarely see where it's missing." Jonathan leaned back slightly. "You could have called me." Her lips pressed together. "I didn't think you'd listen." "That's fair," he said after a moment. She studied him as if recalibrating. "I didn't want special treatment. I wanted to do my job and go home." "You didn't have a home to go to," Jonathan said. Her gaze dropped. "Not right now." Jonathan felt another quiet realization click into place. "You've been staying where?" She hesitated. "Here and there. Friends when I could. Shelters when I couldn't." "And no one knew?" "No one asked," she said. The words weren't angry. They were factual. Jonathan nodded slowly. "My son accused you of stealing." "Yes." "Did he say what?" "No," Denise said. "Just that I owed something. That people like me didn't get to question how things ran." Jonathan felt his jaw tighten. "Did he threaten you?" She considered the question carefully. "He didn't have to." Jonathan understood what she meant, and that understanding unsettled him. "You're not required to say anything else tonight," he said. "Or ever." Denise looked at him. "I know. Whatever you choose, the hospital bill will be covered." She met his eyes. I didn't ask for that. I know, Jonathan said. But it's not charity. It's responsibility. Denise was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I stayed outside because I thought if I left, I'd be admitting I didn't belong anywhere. Even here. Jonathan swallowed. You belonged here. Belonging isn't about location, she said softly. It's about whether someone notices when you're gone. Jonathan didn't have a response to that. A knock sounded at the door. A nurse peeked in, reminding Denise to rest. Jonathan stood. I'll let you sleep, he said. Denise nodded, then spoke just before he reached the door. Mr. Reed? Yes. What happens now? Jonathan paused. He wanted to reassure her, to promise resolution, but the truth felt more honest. I don't know yet, he said, but I'm going to find out. Denise watched him leave, her expression unreadable. And as Jonathan stepped back into the hallway, he realized something with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Denise wasn't afraid anymore. She was deciding. Morning came slowly, pale light pushing through heavy clouds and settling over the estate like a thin veil. The snowstorm had eased during the night, leaving behind a quiet stillness that made everything feel suspended in time. Jonathan Reed sat alone at the long kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling untouched in front of him. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Denise against the stone wall, snow gathering on her coat, the way she'd looked up at him. Not pleading, not grateful, just wary. The house moved around him as it always did. Staff arrived in shifts. Doors opened and closed softly. Someone turned on a radio low in the background, the sound drifting down the hall before being turned off again. Normalcy carefully maintained. Jonathan pushed back his chair and stood. He walked toward the service wing again, drawn there like a loose thread he couldn't ignore. The stone floor was cold underfoot. He passed the lockers, the bulletin board with neatly pinned schedules, the small break room where someone had left a half-empty mug in the sink. He stopped at the service entrance. The door was unlocked now. The keypad light glowed green. Jonathan stepped outside. The snow had been cleared from the walkway, but the stone wall still stood exactly where it always had. He approached it slowly. The spot where Denise had been lying was gone, erased completely, but Jonathan could still picture it. He reached out and touched the cold stone. Sir? Jonathan turned. One of the senior house managers stood a few feet away, posture stiff. Her name was Elaine, and she'd worked for him for nearly a decade. Good morning, Jonathan said. Good morning, she replied. I heard there was an incident last night. Jonathan studied her face. What did you hear? That one of the staff was taken to the hospital. And that she was dismissed for misconduct. Jonathan felt a sharp jolt. Who told you that? Elaine hesitated. Caleb. Jonathan nodded slowly. Did you verify it? She shifted her weight. He said he had authority. And you believed him. He's your son, she said quietly. And he's been handling operations lately. Jonathan let out a long breath. Effective immediately, that changes. Elaine's eyes widened slightly. Sir? My son has no authority over staff, Jonathan said. Any decisions he made are suspended pending review. Elaine nodded. Understood. Jonathan turned back to the wall. Why wasn't I notified when Denise's access was revoked? Elaine swallowed. Security handled it. They said it came from above. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. A chain of small decisions. Each one easier than the last. I want a full report, he said. Access logs, communications, everything. Yes, sir. Elaine lingered. Will Denise be returning? Jonathan turned to her. That will be her decision. Elaine nodded and left. Jonathan remained outside a moment longer, the cold biting through his coat again. He thought of how many times he'd walked past this door without noticing who used it, who waited at it, who might be turned away from it. Back inside, he went straight to his office and began pulling records. Denise's employment history, internal emails, security authorizations. The deeper he looked, the clearer the pattern became. Authority flowed downward. Responsibility evaporated upward. His phone rang. The hospital. Denise had been discharged with instructions to rest and avoid exposure. She didn't have a permanent address listed. Jonathan thanked the nurse and hung up, staring at the phone longer than necessary. He could offer her a place to stay. Would be easy, logical, and wrong. He called instead and arranged a hotel near the hospital, paid for a week in advance. Transportation included. No conditions. When he texted Denise the details, her reply came a minute later. Thank you. I'll accept this. No exclamation point. No excess gratitude. Jonathan respected that more than he expected. The day wore on, filled with calls and quiet corrections. Security managers were questioned. Policies reviewed. Lines redrawn. But beneath it all, something gnawed at him. Why had Denise stayed silent for so long? That question followed him into the evening, lingering as snow began to fall again, light this time, almost gentle. Somewhere across town, Denise was awake, staring at a ceiling that wasn't hers, deciding what to do with the truth she carried. And Jonathan knew with growing certainty that when she spoke, it wouldn't just change her life. It would expose things he could no longer protect. Denise sat on the edge of the hotel bed, her coat folded neatly beside her, hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea that had already gone cold. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and artificial citrus, the kind of neutral scent meant to make everyone feel comfortable and no one feel at home. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the keypad flashing red. Denied. Denied. The sound wasn't loud in reality, just a soft electronic chime, but in her head it echoed. Her phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. She stared at it for a long moment before opening it. We need to talk. This doesn't have to be a problem. She didn't need to ask who it was from. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She typed, erased, typed again. You already made it a problem. The response came almost immediately. You're being dramatic. Come back and we'll straighten this out. Denise let out a quiet laugh, the sound catching in her throat. Straighten this out. Like a wrinkle. Like a misunderstanding. She set the phone face down on the nightstand and stood, pacing the small room. Outside the window, traffic moved steadily, people going about their lives, unaware that 2 nights ago she'd been curled up in the snow wondering if anyone would notice if she didn't wake up. Another buzz. If you push this, it won't end well for you. That one made her stop walking. Her hands trembled just slightly. She picked up the phone again, stared at the message, then took a screenshot and saved it to a folder already labeled, carefully and deliberately. She sat back down on the bed and finally replied. Do not contact me again. She blocked the number. Across town, Jonathan Reed ended a call with his legal advisor and rubbed his temples. The day had been a series of small revelations, each one more unsettling than the last. Procedures ignored. Authority assumed without confirmation. Complaints quietly redirected instead of addressed. Not erased. Buried. His assistant knocked lightly and stepped in. Sir, security management is here. Jonathan nodded. Send them in. 2 men entered, both stiff, both overly formal. Jonathan didn't offer them seats. Explain to me, he said, how an employee's access can be revoked without my knowledge. One of the men cleared his throat. We received a directive. From whom? There was an authorization code attached. Jonathan leaned forward. A code is not a person. The man hesitated. It was associated with Caleb Reed. Jonathan felt something cold settle in his chest. And that was enough? He's your son, the second man said. We assumed. You assumed wrong, Jonathan cut in. You don't act on assumptions. You act on verification. Silence. Jonathan straightened. You will provide a full written account. Every communication. Every override. Today. Yes, sir. When they left, Jonathan didn't sit. He paced the length of the office, jaw tight. This wasn't just about Denise anymore. It was about how easily the structure he trusted could be bent by proximity to power. His phone rang again. This time it was Denise. Jonathan answered immediately. Are you all right? Yes, she said. But I need you to know something. He listened. She told him about the messages. The threat wrapped in casual language. The implication that she should stay quiet if she knew what was good for her. Jonathan felt heat rise behind his eyes. Did you save them? Yes. Good, he said. That was the right thing to do. There was a pause. I didn't do it because it was right, Denise said. I did it because I'm tired of pretending things like this don't happen. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. I won't let this be ignored. I believe you want to help, she said. But I need to be clear about something. Go on. I'm not asking to come back, Denise said. And I'm not asking for protection. Jonathan frowned. Then what are you asking for? I want the truth on record, she said. Not just about what happened to me. About why it was possible. Jonathan felt the weight of that settle in. I don't know yet what that will cost, she continued. But I know what staying quiet already cost me. Jonathan didn't interrupt. I'll cooperate, Denise said. I'll answer questions. I'll give statements. But I won't be handled quietly. Jonathan exhaled slowly. That may open doors you can't close. I know, she said. That's why I'm calling now. Before it starts. Jonathan stood still, the estate around him suddenly feeling smaller, more fragile. All right, he said finally. Then we do this properly. After the call ended, Jonathan stared at his desk at the family photos arranged carefully along the edge. Smiling faces. Holiday gatherings. A version of stability he believed in for a long time. Somewhere not far away, Caleb was realizing he no longer controlled the narrative. And Denise, alone in a borrowed room, had just made a decision that couldn't be undone. Neither of them knew it yet, but the next move wouldn't belong to the powerful. It would belong to the truth. The conference room felt colder than the rest of the building, though Jonathan knew that was psychological. Long tables had a way of doing that. They made people sit straighter, speak carefully, hide behind posture and prepared language. He arrived early and stood at the window looking down at the city below. Cars moved in tight lines. People hurried along sidewalks, collars turned up against the cold. From up here, everything looked orderly, predictable. He turned as the first executives filed in. There were 6 of them, all familiar faces. Men Jonathan had worked with for years. Some longer than his own son had been alive. They took their seats with practiced ease, nodding politely, exchanging low greetings. No one mentioned Denise. Jonathan waited until everyone was seated before speaking. We're here to discuss an incident involving one of our employees, he said. His voice was calm, measured. And the systems that allowed it to happen. A few brows furrowed. One man adjusted his glasses. Which incident? Jonathan didn't answer right away. He pressed a button on the remote, and the screen at the end of the room lit up. Security footage froze on an image of Denise standing at the service entrance, her hand raised toward the keypad. The room went quiet. This employee, Jonathan said, was locked out of her workplace in sub-freezing temperatures. She was later found unconscious on company property. Murmurs rippled around the table. That's terrible, one executive said quickly. But surely that was a misunderstanding. Jonathan turned to him. Then explain the access denial. Another man leaned forward. We've looked into that. The override came through an authorized channel. Yes, Jonathan said. And that channel was misused. The same executive cleared his throat. With respect, Jonathan, staff disputes happen. This could have been handled internally. Jonathan's gaze sharpened. It was handled internally. That's the problem. Silence again. Jonathan continued, this employee had no prior disciplinary actions. No theft reports. No warnings. Yet her access was revoked, her termination implied, and she was left without support. One of the men shifted uncomfortably. Are we talking about litigation risk? Jonathan nodded. That's part of it. And the other part? Someone asked. Jonathan clicked to the next slide. An internal report summary appeared on the screen. Redacted names. Dates. Compliance flags. This same employee filed an anonymous report 6 months ago, Jonathan said. It triggered an audit that saved this company from severe penalties. A few faces drained of color. That report, Jonathan continued, Outlined labor violations at one of our distribution facilities. Underpayment. Falsified hours. A man near the end of the table leaned back sharply. That report was anonymous. We never identified the source. Jonathan met his eyes. We have now. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone exhaled slowly. You're saying a housekeeper, one executive began. Jonathan raised a hand. An employee, he corrected, who saw something wrong and spoke up. Another voice, quieter now. And she's accusing Caleb. Jonathan didn't look away. Yes. That name landed differently. He felt it in the room, the subtle recalibration. This wasn't just a staffing issue anymore. This was personal. Political. One man spoke carefully. Jonathan, your son has had difficulties, but involving him publicly. This isn't about protecting family, Jonathan said. It's about acknowledging failure. A beat passed. And, Jonathan added, there may be more. That got their attention. Jonathan slid a thin folder across the table. This is preliminary, but it suggests patterns. Complaints redirected. Investigations softened. Language used to discourage escalation. A few executives flipped through pages, their expressions tightening. Where did this come from? Someone asked. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He thought of Denise sitting alone in that hotel room, carefully documenting messages, saving proof not because she trusted the system, but because she didn't. It came from listening, Jonathan said finally, to people we usually don't hear. The meeting ended without resolution. No shouting. No dramatic exits. Just unease. Promises to review. To reconvene. As the executives filed out, Jonathan remained seated, staring at the empty chairs. He knew how this would go. There would be pressure. Quiet suggestions. Warnings about reputation and shareholder confidence. About proportional responses. About keeping things contained. His phone buzzed. A text from an unfamiliar number. I hear you're asking questions. Be careful which doors you open. Jonathan stared at the message, his reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen. Somewhere, someone had already decided this had gone too far. And for the first time since that night in the snow, Jonathan understood something clearly. The system wasn't broken. It was defending itself. Jonathan arrived at the hospital just after dusk. The sky outside washed in dull gray and fading blue. The building glowed from within, a quiet island of light against the cold. He'd been there twice already since Denise was admitted, but this time felt different. He wasn't coming to check on her condition. He was coming to listen. Denise sat upright in bed, dressed now in borrowed clothes, a soft sweater and sweatpants the hospital provided for patients being discharged. Her hair was pulled back, still slightly damp from a recent shower. She looked steadier than before, but there was a guarded focus in her eyes that hadn't been there the first night. You look like someone who didn't sleep, she said as Jonathan entered. He managed a faint smile. That's accurate. She gestured to the chair. You don't have to stand. Jonathan sat. For a moment, they listened to the muted sounds of the hospital around them. Distant footsteps, a rolling cart, a voice paging a nurse over the intercom. I met with the executives today, Jonathan said. Denise nodded. I figured you would. They're concerned, he added carefully. That's one word for it, she replied. Jonathan studied her. You seem less surprised than I expected. Denise folded her hands in her lap. When you live close to power long enough, you learn how it reacts when it's uncomfortable. He didn't argue. I wanted to ask you something, Jonathan said, and I want an honest answer. You've been honest with me so far, Denise said. Go ahead. Why didn't you come to me? He asked. Not just about Caleb. About the violations. The report. Denise leaned back against the pillows. Because people like you don't usually want to hear from people like me. Jonathan felt the instinctive urge to disagree but stopped himself. I don't mean that as an insult, she continued. It's just how systems work. There are doors that open automatically for some people. For others, you need proof just to knock. Jonathan nodded slowly. I filed that report because I couldn't not, Denise said. I saw what was happening at the distribution center. People working double shifts but getting paid for one. Injuries being written off as clumsiness. You worked there too? Jonathan asked. Temporarily. Staffing shortages, she said. I cleaned offices, bathrooms, break rooms. You hear things when people think you're invisible. Jonathan felt a quiet shame settle in his chest. I didn't expect it to lead anywhere, Denise admitted. I assumed it would be buried. Or ignored. But it wasn't, Jonathan said. No, she replied. And that's when things changed. She looked at him, meeting his gaze directly now. Caleb started paying attention to me after that audit. Not because he knew it was me. Because he knew someone had embarrassed the company. Jonathan clenched his jaw. He'd make comments, Denise continued, about loyalty, about knowing your place, about how easily people could be replaced. Jonathan said nothing. I kept my head down, she said. I told myself it would pass. But it didn't, Jonathan said. No, Denise replied. It escalated. She shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket. The night he accused me of stealing, he wasn't angry. He was calm. That scared me more. Jonathan felt a chill run through him. He told me people like me made mistakes when they forgot who controlled the doors, Denise said quietly. I didn't understand what he meant until the keypad turned red. Jonathan exhaled slowly. I'm sorry. Denise studied him for a moment. I believe that. He looked up, surprised. But being sorry doesn't fix systems, she added. It just makes people feel better while they stay the same. Jonathan nodded. You're right. A nurse knocked lightly and stepped in, reminding Denise she'd be discharged shortly. Jonathan stood as the nurse left. I don't know what this becomes yet, Jonathan said. There will be investigations. Push back. I expect that, Denise said. But I want you to know something, he continued. Whatever happens next, I won't ask you to disappear. Denise looked at him steadily. Good. Because I won't. Jonathan headed for the door, then paused. Denise, he said. You should know, this is already bigger than my son. She didn't look surprised. I know, she said. That's why I stayed awake last night. Jonathan left the room with that sentence echoing in his mind. Because people who stay awake aren't waiting for rescue. They're preparing for impact. Denise's hotel room had begun to feel less temporary than she liked. The curtains never fully closed, letting in a strip of orange light from the parking lot outside. At night, headlights swept across the walls like restless thoughts. She sat at the small desk, laptop open, papers spread neatly beside it. Old pay stubs. Notes she'd taken over months. Dates. Times. Names written carefully in the margins. She'd learned long ago that memory alone wasn't enough. Her phone rang. Jonathan. She hesitated before answering, then picked up. Hello. I wanted to check in, he said. See how you're holding up. I'm still standing, Denise replied. That's something. Jonathan smiled faintly on the other end. It is. There was a pause, then he said, I need to understand the timeline. Not just what happened that night. What led to it. Denise leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting to the window. It didn't start with Caleb, she said. Jonathan waited. It started when the audit happened, Denise continued. Not the violations themselves. The response to them. What do you mean? People got nervous, she said. Not the workers. Management. Schedules changed. Supervisors rotated. Certain names stopped appearing on rosters. Jonathan felt a tightening in his chest. I didn't know any of that, he said. I know, Denise replied. That's why it worked. She explained how complaints were quietly redirected. How certain employees were labeled as difficult for asking questions. How overtime was reassigned to avoid paper trails. No one ever said, this is punishment, Denise said. They didn't have to. Jonathan rubbed his forehead. And Caleb? He noticed the tension, Denise said. He liked it. Power is attractive to people who feel like they're losing it elsewhere. Jonathan said nothing. At first he was just present, Denise continued. Standing too close. Watching. asking questions that weren't his to ask. You reported it? Jonathan asked. She laughed softly. To who? Jonathan winced. I asked for reassignment, Denise said. I said I was uncomfortable. And? They told me to keep things professional, to avoid misunderstandings. Jonathan felt anger rise. That's unacceptable. It's common, Denise replied. She paused, then added, after that the comments started. What kind of comments? About loyalty, gratitude, about how some people should be thankful just to be allowed into certain spaces. Jonathan exhaled sharply. He never touched me, Denise said. Not directly. He didn't need to. Jonathan understood what she meant, and the understanding made his stomach turn. By the time he accused me of stealing, Denise continued, he already knew no one would challenge him. Jonathan looked at his desk, at the neat stacks of reports waiting for review. He was wrong. Yes, Denise said. But not by accident. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. I'm starting to see how deep this goes. Good, Denise replied. Because it doesn't end with me. Jonathan looked up. What do you mean? There are others, she said. Different departments. Different locations. Same patterns. Jonathan felt a quiet dread settle in. I don't expect you to fix everything, Denise added. But I need you to understand why I can't just accept a check and move on. Jonathan nodded, though she couldn't see him. I do understand. There was a moment of silence, then Denise spoke again, more softly. I stayed quiet because it felt safer, she said. But it didn't keep me safe. Jonathan swallowed. I won't ask you to be quiet now. I know, Denise replied. But that means things are about to get harder. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Harder for who? Denise didn't answer right away. For everyone who's been comfortable, she said finally. After the call ended, Denise closed her laptop and sat still for a long time. Outside, a car alarm chirped and fell silent. Life went on, indifferent. Across town, Jonathan stared at a list of departments flagged for review, realizing that the night he found Denise in the snow wasn't an isolated moment. It was the point where all the small, ignored decisions finally converged. And once seen, they couldn't be unseen. The shelter smelled like disinfectant and overcooked coffee. Denise noticed it immediately, the way some people notice perfume or fresh paint. Certain smells stayed with you when you learned to associate them with waiting. She sat on a plastic chair near the wall, coat folded in her lap, watching a television mounted high in the corner. The volume was low. A morning news anchor spoke about traffic delays and weather patterns, his tone cheerful and detached. Denise had been here before. Not this exact building, but places like it. Temporary spaces designed to move people through, not let them settle. You signed in. You waited. You followed rules that were never written down but always enforced. She glanced at the clock. Jonathan would be arriving soon. She hadn't wanted to meet him here. Not because she was ashamed, but because she didn't want him to misunderstand. This wasn't a symbol. It was logistics. Still, when she told him where she'd been staying before the hotel, there'd been a pause on the line. Not judgment. Just surprise. That surprised her. The door opened, letting in a blast of cold air and noise from outside. Denise looked up instinctively. Jonathan stepped inside, scanning the room until his eyes found hers. He crossed the space carefully, as if unsure whether he belonged there. You didn't have to come, Denise said as he sat beside her. I wanted to, he replied. If you're willing. She nodded. I am. They sat quietly for a moment, the sounds of the shelter filling the space between them. A woman laughed somewhere down the hall. Someone coughed repeatedly. A volunteer called out names from a clipboard. This is where you stayed? Jonathan asked softly. Sometimes, Denise said. Other times, friends. Other times, nowhere. Jonathan shifted in his seat. Why didn't you tell anyone at work? She looked at him. Because needing help makes people look at you differently. He frowned. It shouldn't. No, Denise agreed. But it does. She explained how easily things unraveled. A missed paycheck. A rent increase. A friend who could only help for so long. How quickly stability became conditional. You learn to manage, she said. You pack light. You don't complain. Jonathan listened, hands clasped tightly together. And the night you were locked out, you could have come here. It was full, Denise said. And I was already there too much. You start to feel like you're taking someone else's spot. Jonathan felt a knot form in his chest. I thought if I waited until morning, Denise continued, someone would see me. Or at least I wouldn't be in the way. Jonathan swallowed. You weren't in the way. She gave a small smile. I know that now. A staff member approached and spoke quietly with Denise, letting her know her allotted time was nearly up. Denise thanked her and stood. Outside the air was sharp and clean. Snow crunched underfoot as they walked a few steps away from the entrance. I didn't bring you here to make a point, Denise said. I brought you here so you'd understand why I didn't leave that night. Jonathan nodded slowly. I think I do. She looked at him closely. Do you? He hesitated. I understand that you had nowhere that felt safe. That's part of it, Denise said. The other part is that I was tired of running. Jonathan looked away, jaw tight. There's something else, Denise added. Something I haven't told you yet. He turned back to her. What is it? She took a breath. The night I was locked out wasn't the first time my access was restricted. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. When else? Twice before, she said. Briefly. Always explained as a system error. Always after I asked questions. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. I didn't say anything because the access always came back, Denise continued. I told myself it was coincidence. And now? Jonathan asked. Now I know it wasn't. Jonathan stood there in the cold, the shelter door opening and closing behind them, people moving in and out without noticing. How many others? He asked quietly. Denise met his eyes. I don't know. But I know how to find out. Jonathan realized then that Denise wasn't just recounting the past. She was outlining the future. And he had a feeling that once she started pulling on that thread, there would be no clean way to stop what unraveled next. Jonathan returned to his office long after sunset, the building nearly empty. The lights were dimmed automatically now, responding to motion, turning on just long enough to remind him how alone he was in the space. He didn't turn on the overheads. He preferred the quiet. He sat at his desk and opened the first folder Elaine had delivered earlier that afternoon. Security logs, access records, email chains. The kind of paperwork most executives skimmed for conclusions instead of causes. Jonathan read everything. Denied access. Restored access. Manual override. No explanation attached. The pattern Denise had described was there, faint but unmistakable. Short disruptions. Just long enough to unsettle someone. Just short enough to dismiss as error. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. This wasn't chaos. It was calibration. Jonathan pulled up the security audio files next. Time-stamped recordings from the gatehouse, the service desk, internal lines rarely reviewed unless something went wrong. Something had gone wrong. He clicked on a file from the night Denise was locked out. At first there was nothing but static and background noise. Then voices. You sure about this? A guard asked, voice low. Yeah, another replied. I got the go-ahead. From who? Pause. Paper shuffling. Caleb Reed. Jonathan's jaw tightened. She's still on shift, the first guard said. We're not supposed to. I know, the second cut in. Just do it. I don't want problems. Jonathan stopped the recording. Problems. He played another file, dated 2 weeks earlier. Her code's acting up again, someone said. Just reset it, came the response. She complains too much anyway. Jonathan felt something heavy settle behind his ribs. Not anger yet. Something colder. He opened the email records next. Filtered by keywords. Access. Incident. Staff concern. A thread caught his eye. From Security Supervisor to Operations. Subject. Temporary access adjustment, staff member. The body was brief. Vague. Carefully worded. Per directive received, access has been adjusted. No action required at this time. Jonathan stared at the phrase. No action required. He forwarded the email to his legal counsel, then leaned back and rubbed his eyes. He'd built an empire on systems. Redundancy. Oversight. Checks that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of thing. But systems were only as ethical as the people enforcing them. His phone buzzed. A message from Denise. I remembered something else. Jonathan typed back immediately. Go on. She called instead. I didn't think it mattered before, Denise said. But now I think it does. Tell me. There was a meeting, she said. Months ago. After the audit. Not a big one. Just department heads. Jonathan frowned. You were present? I was cleaning the room, Denise replied. They didn't stop talking. Jonathan closed his eyes. One of them asked how the complaint got through, she continued. Someone else joked that at least it came from outside the food chain. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. Another voice said they'd tighten access to prevent future surprises, Denise said. I didn't know what that meant at the time. Jonathan stood and walked toward the window. Snow had started again, light flakes drifting down, catching the glow of streetlights. Do you remember who said it? He asked. Yes, Denise replied. She named him. Jonathan didn't respond right away. The name was one he knew well. A man he trusted. A man who'd sat in the conference room just days earlier, nodding solemnly while discussing accountability. Jonathan, Denise said. I'm here, he replied. That wasn't the only thing, she added. Someone laughed. Said people like me didn't know what we heard. Jonathan felt a bitter irony twist in his stomach. They were wrong, he said quietly. Yes, Denise replied. But they believed they weren't. The call ended shortly after. Denise had said everything she needed to say. Jonathan returned to his desk and opened a new document. He began listing names, dates, connections, not accusations, just facts. The list grew quickly. He realized then that what he was looking at wasn't a single abuse of power. It was a culture. One that rewarded silence and punished visibility. His assistant knocked softly and stepped in. Sir, there's a notice from legal. Jonathan took the document and read it once. Then again. A formal complaint had been filed. Not privately. Not quietly. Denise Carter versus Reed Holdings. Jonathan set the paper down slowly. This was no longer something he could contain. And somewhere inside the system he'd helped build, people were already scrambling to protect themselves. The only question left was who would be exposed first. The call with legal came early the next morning, before Jonathan had finished his first cup of coffee. His office windows were still dark, the city below wrapped in that gray-blue hush that came just before sunrise. Elaine's voice was calm, practiced. Too calm. The complaint is formal, she said. Filed with the state and federal labor boards. Civil action will follow. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. How long has it been in motion? Longer than you think, Elaine replied. Weeks, maybe months. This wasn't written overnight. Jonathan stared at the steam rising from his mug. Denise hadn't rushed. She hadn't reacted emotionally. She'd prepared. What exactly is she alleging? Jonathan asked. Elaine exhaled softly. Retaliation. Wrongful denial of access. Endangerment. Patterned harassment. Failure to intervene. Each word landed with weight. And, Elaine continued, there's documentation. A lot of it. Jonathan closed his eyes. Security logs, internal emails, witness statements, Elaine said. Some anonymized. Some not. Who else is named? Jonathan asked. There was a pause. Not just your son, Elaine said carefully. Senior staff. Operations. Security oversight. The exposure is broad. Jonathan thanked her and ended the call. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the air before a storm. He stood and walked slowly toward the window. Below him, the city was waking up. Cars moved. Lights flicked on. People went about their mornings, unaware that inside this building, an entire structure was beginning to crack. His phone buzzed again. A text from Denise. I wanted you to hear it from me before the news does. Jonathan typed back. I appreciate that. Are you okay? A moment passed. As okay as someone can be when they finally stop pretending nothing's wrong. Jonathan set the phone down. He hadn't expected gratitude or forgiveness, but the quiet steadiness of her message unsettled him more than anger ever could. By midday, the first internal meeting convened. Faces filled the conference room screen, some in person, others remote. Familiar names. Trusted voices. Jonathan watched them carefully. We should contain this, one executive said. Settle quickly. Avoid escalation. Another nodded. Public exposure helps no one. Jonathan leaned forward. It helps the truth, he said. The room went still. A man near the far end cleared his throat. With respect, Jonathan, you're emotionally involved. Jonathan met his gaze. With respect, that's the point. No one spoke. Jonathan continued. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because people believed no one would notice. Or care. A few eyes shifted downward. We will cooperate fully, Jonathan said. Every request. Every investigation. Someone interrupted. That could damage the company. Jonathan's voice remained steady. Then the damage already exists. The meeting ended without resolution. No applause. No relief. Just tension lingering in the room long after the screen went dark. Later that afternoon, Jonathan drove to the hotel where Denise was staying. He hadn't told her he was coming. She answered the door cautiously, chain still latched until she recognized him. You didn't have to, she said again. I know, Jonathan replied. The room was small. Clean. Temporary. A single suitcase sat by the wall, zipped shut as if she might need to leave at any moment. They told me about the complaint, Jonathan said. Denise nodded. I assumed they would. You could have settled quietly, he said. Many people would have. She sat on the edge of the bed. Quiet is how this kept happening. Jonathan watched her closely. How long have you been collecting information? Denise hesitated. Long enough to be sure I wasn't imagining things. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn notebook. Pages bent. Corners folded. I didn't trust emails, she said. Or systems. Jonathan took the notebook gently. Dates. Names. Times. Observations written in careful, restrained handwriting. This isn't revenge, Denise said. It's record-keeping. Jonathan nodded. You knew this would cost you. Yes, she replied. But silence was costing me more. A knock sounded at the door. Denise froze. Jonathan turned. Did you expect anyone? She shook her head. The knock came again, firmer this time. Jonathan moved toward the door and looked through the peephole. Two men stood outside. One in a suit. One holding a folder. Jonathan's stomach tightened. They're early, he said quietly. Denise stood, shoulders tense but chin lifted. What do they want? She asked. Jonathan unlocked the chain. To start asking questions. As the door opened, Jonathan realized this was no longer about damage control. This was the beginning of something neither of them could fully step away from now. The investigators arrived without ceremony. No raised voices. No flashing lights. Just questions delivered in even tones and written down carefully, as if the answers might matter later. They sat at the small desk by the window, folders open, pens ready. Denise chose the chair closest to the door. Jonathan noticed. People who had learned to leave quickly always did. This is voluntary, one of the men said. You can stop at any time. Denise nodded. I won't. The questions started simply. Dates. Job title. Length of employment. Denise answered without hesitation. Jonathan sat nearby, quiet, resisting the instinct to interrupt or explain. Then the tone shifted. Did you ever report concerns prior to the incident? The investigator asked. Yes, Denise said. How? Anonymously. Jonathan's head turned sharply. The investigator glanced up. Can you elaborate? Denise folded her hands in her lap. There was a hotline posted in the break room. For labor compliance. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. I used it, Denise continued. Twice. The investigator scribbled notes. What prompted those reports? Denise looked toward the window for a moment. Snow drifted slowly past the glass. Overtime violations, she said. Security overrides. Staff being locked out of spaces they needed to do their jobs. Jonathan swallowed. Why anonymously? The investigator asked. Because I'd seen what happened to people who weren't, Denise replied. They stopped getting shifts. Their access changed. They were told they were difficult. Jonathan felt the weight of her words settle. Did you receive any follow-up? The investigator asked. No, Denise said. But the violations stopped. Jonathan leaned forward. You never told me. Denise didn't look at him. You weren't meant to know. The investigator raised an eyebrow. Why do you say that? Because if leadership knew where the report came from, Denise said, the protection would disappear. Jonathan felt something fracture inside him. The system he'd trusted to surface truth had been used to bury it. After the reports, the investigator continued, did anything change? Denise nodded. Access delays. Extra scrutiny. Comments. What kind of comments? The investigator asked. Denise hesitated. About loyalty. About knowing one's place. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. The investigator flipped to a new page. Did you document these changes? Yes. Denise reached into her bag and pulled out a slim folder. Inside were copies of schedules, handwritten notes, timestamps recorded carefully. Jonathan recognized the discipline. Not paranoia. Precision. I didn't think it would come to this, Denise said. But I knew I needed proof. The investigator looked up. Proof of what? That it wasn't random, Denise replied. Jonathan felt a rush of shame. He'd spent years preaching accountability without realizing who had been holding it together when leadership failed. After the investigators left, the room felt emptier than before. Denise sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted. You reported us, Jonathan said quietly. I reported behavior, Denise corrected. There's a difference. Jonathan nodded. You protected the company. I protected the people who didn't have options, Denise replied. Jonathan paced the room. All this time, I thought I was insulated from the worst of it. You were, Denise said. By design. Jonathan stopped. Who knew about the reports? More people than should have, Denise replied. Someone tipped them off. Jonathan felt the cold realization creep in. That's why the access issues started, he said. Yes, Denise replied. They didn't know it was me. But they knew it was someone close. Jonathan leaned against the wall. You risked everything. Denise looked at him steadily. You risk comfort when you speak up. I risked survival when I didn't. Jonathan had no response. Later that evening, Jonathan returned to his office. Another envelope waited on his desk, unmarked. Inside were copies of internal memos. Handwritten annotations in the margins. He recognized Denise's handwriting. At the bottom of the last page was a note. They think this ends with me. Jonathan folded the paper slowly. For the first time, he understood the scope of what Denise had started, and why the people who built their power on silence were already afraid. Jonathan waited until nightfall before calling Caleb. Not because he needed time to cool down, but because he needed the day to pass without interruption. Some conversations required darkness. Fewer witnesses. Less noise. Caleb answered on the third ring. What's going on? He asked, irritation already in his voice. I'm in the middle of something. Jonathan said nothing at first. He listened. The faint music in the background. Voices. Laughter. A life uninterrupted. I need you to come home, Jonathan said. Pause. Now. Yes. Caleb sighed. Is this about that woman again? Jonathan closed his eyes. Be here in an hour, he said, and ended the call. The house was silent when Caleb arrived. No staff. No lights beyond the entry hall. Jonathan sat at the long dining table, a single lamp illuminating a stack of folders in front of him. Caleb stopped short when he saw them. What's this? He asked. Sit down, Jonathan replied. Caleb rolled his eyes but obeyed, dropping into the chair across from him. Jonathan slid the first folder forward. "Do you recognize this?" Caleb flipped it open. "Security logs. Access records." He shrugged. "Looks like paperwork." Jonathan slid another folder forward. "Audio transcripts." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. Jonathan leaned forward. "You ordered a guard to lock Denise Carter out of the property." Caleb scoffed. "I didn't lock her out. I told them to suspend access. There's a difference." Jonathan's voice remained calm. "Not to someone outside in the snow." Caleb leaned back. "She was insubordinate. She accused people of things she didn't understand." "She filed labor complaints," Jonathan said. Caleb laughed. "Exactly." Jonathan felt something twist inside him. "You retaliated." "I managed risk," Caleb replied. "She was a liability." Jonathan stood slowly. "She almost died." Caleb's expression hardened. "You're exaggerating." Jonathan slammed his hand on the table. The sound echoed through the empty house. "Do not," he said quietly, "minimize what you did." Caleb stared back, defiant. "You taught me to protect the company." Jonathan shook his head. "I taught you to protect people." Caleb snorted. "Same thing." Silence stretched between them. Jonathan opened the final folder. Inside were copies of Denise's notes. Handwritten timelines. Patterns clearly visible. "She reported violations anonymously," Jonathan said. "She saved us from regulatory fines. From lawsuits." Caleb shrugged. "She should have stayed anonymous." Jonathan looked at his son. Really looked. "You believe she deserved what happened," Jonathan said. Caleb didn't answer. That was answer enough. "You abused your authority," Jonathan continued. "You endangered an employee. And you lied." Caleb stood abruptly. "You're choosing her over me." Jonathan's voice cracked. "I'm choosing the truth." Caleb's eyes flashed. "You're throwing me under the bus to look noble." Jonathan shook his head. "I'm removing you from harm." Caleb laughed bitterly. "You think this ends with me gone?" Jonathan met his gaze. "No. But it starts there." Caleb grabbed his coat. "You can't do this." "I already have," Jonathan replied. Caleb stopped at the doorway. "You'll regret this." Jonathan didn't respond. The door slammed shut. Jonathan sank back into his chair, the weight of the decision settling heavily on him. He stared at the folders, at the evidence that had forced his hand. His phone buzzed. A message from Denise. "Did he tell you the truth?" Jonathan typed back slowly. "He told me who he is." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Jonathan realized this confrontation wasn't an ending. It was a fracture. And fractures had a way of spreading far beyond their point of origin. The paperwork was finished before the sun came up. Jonathan hadn't slept. He sat at his desk, jacket still on, tie loosened, signing documents with a hand that felt heavier with every page. Each signature carried a consequence. Not just for the company but for his family. By the time the first executive arrived that morning, the decision had already been made. Caleb Reed was removed from all operational authority, effective immediately. No press release. No dramatic announcement. Just a formal notice circulated to leadership and legal. Access revoked. Credentials disabled. Corporate accounts frozen. Exile, dressed in professional language. Elaine stood across from Jonathan as he placed the final document into a folder. "You know this won't be quiet," she said. Jonathan nodded. "It shouldn't be." She hesitated. "He's your son." Jonathan didn't look up. "He's an adult." The building felt different as the news spread. Conversation stopped when Jonathan passed. People looked at him with something between respect and fear. He didn't blame them. At noon, Caleb's assistant cleared out his office. Boxes were stacked neatly in the hallway. No one offered help. No one asked questions. Jonathan watched from his doorway as the elevator doors closed around them. That was it. No confrontation. No reconciliation. Just absence. Later that afternoon, Jonathan called Denise. "It's done," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" He's gone, Jonathan replied. Removed from the company. Denise exhaled slowly. Thank you for telling me. I didn't do it for gratitude, Jonathan said. I know, she replied. That's why it matters. They ended the call without ceremony. Jonathan stayed late again that night. Emails poured in. Legal updates. Statements drafted and revised. Crisis consultants offering guidance. He ignored most of it. Instead, he pulled up a list of staff complaints filed over the past 5 years. Most had been marked resolved. Close. Archive. He reopened them. One by one. Patterns emerged. The same departments. The same supervisors. The same quiet exits. Jonathan felt the weight of collective neglect settle on him. This wasn't about one son. It never had been. A knock came at the door. Elaine stepped in, face tight. You should see this. She handed him her tablet. An internal message, forwarded anonymously. If leadership thinks sacrificing one name fixes this, they're mistaken. Jonathan looked up. Who sent it? Elaine shook her head. No trace. Jonathan handed the tablet back. They're right. Elaine frowned. About what? This isn't finished, Jonathan said. It's just visible now. That evening, Jonathan drove past the service entrance where he'd found Denise in the snow. The stone wall loomed in his headlights, unchanged. He stopped the car and got out. The cold air cut through him. He stood there longer than necessary, imagining what it must have felt like to wait through the night, uncertain whether morning would come in time. His phone buzzed. A message from Denise. They've started calling me. Jonathan typed back. Oh, reporters. Former employees. People I don't recognize. Jonathan stared at the wall. Be careful, he typed. And don't agree to anything without counsel. I won't, she replied. But I won't disappear either. Jonathan slipped the phone into his pocket. He realized then that Caleb's removal hadn't closed a chapter. It had opened a door. And behind it were years of stories that had never been told. The settlement offer was generous. Intentionally so. Jonathan knew that before he saw the numbers. He'd approved enough of them over the years to recognize the language. Large enough to quiet outrage. Structured enough to feel respectful. Wrapped in confidentiality clauses that read like courtesy and functioned like erasure. Elaine slid the document across the table during their afternoon meeting. Her attorneys expect this, she said. It's standard. Jonathan scanned the pages without really reading them. His eyes stopped on the final paragraph. Non-disclosure. Non-disparagement. Mutual release. This assumes she wants to leave quietly, Jonathan said. Elaine nodded. Most people do. Jonathan folded the document. Send it anyway. Denise received the offer the next morning. She read it twice, slowly, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed. The numbers made her stomach tighten. Not because they were tempting, but because she understood what they were meant to do. She called Jonathan. They think this ends with money, she said. Jonathan didn't interrupt. I won't take it, Denise continued. Not like this. Jonathan exhaled. I expected that. Silence hung between them. They're afraid, Denise said finally. That's why it's so clean. Yes, Jonathan replied. And fear makes people sloppy. Denise gave a short, humorless laugh. It makes them generous too. Jonathan hesitated. This will get harder. I know, Denise said. But it already was. Later that day, Denise met with her attorney in a small office that smelled faintly of old books and lemon cleaner. The attorney listened without interruption as Denise explained her refusal. You understand what you're giving up, the attorney said. Yes, Denise replied. And what I'm protecting. What's that? The attorney asked. My voice, Denise said. And everyone else's. The attorney nodded slowly. Then we proceed. By evening, the rejection had reached Reed Holdings. Elaine called Jonathan immediately. They're unsettled, she said. They didn't expect this. Jonathan looked out his office window. The city lights flickered on below. Good, he said. The press began circling the next day. Questions sharpened. Speculation grew. Anonymous sources whispered about a deeper problem. Jonathan issued a single statement. We will not silence accountability with money. It wasn't polished. It wasn't safe. It was true. Denise watched the coverage from her hotel room, volume low, phone buzzing constantly. Messages from former co-workers. Some grateful. Some afraid. One stood out. I thought I was the only one. Denise stared at the screen for a long time before replying. You weren't. That night, Denise opened her notebook again. Not to add to it but to decide what came next. Jonathan received an email after midnight. Subject line, additional material. No sender name. Attached was a compressed file. Jonathan didn't open it immediately. He stared at the screen, instinct warning him that whatever was inside would shift the ground again. He clicked. Folders unfolded. Names. Departments. Incidents cross-referenced with dates Denise had already documented. This wasn't just her story. It was many. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the weight of it pressing down. Somewhere in the building, people were still calculating how to survive this. They didn't yet realize that Denise hadn't refused the settlement to fight harder. She had refused it because the fight had already grown beyond any single payout. Denise asked to meet Jonathan somewhere neutral. Not the office. Not the hotel. A small public library halfway between the city and the suburbs, the kind of place people used when they didn't want to be overheard but didn't want secrecy either. Jonathan arrived early and sat at a long wooden table near the back. The building was quiet except for the soft hum of lights and the occasional shuffle of pages. Denise arrived carrying a canvas tote bag worn at the edges. You look tired, Jonathan said. She smiled faintly. I am. They sat across from each other. Denise didn't waste time. There's more, she said. Jonathan nodded. I've seen some of it. She reached into the bag and pulled out a slim flash drive. Placed it on the table between them. This is everything I didn't send, she said. Because once you have it, you can't unknow it. Jonathan didn't touch it yet. Why show me now? Because people are panicking, Denise replied. And panic makes them dangerous. Jonathan studied her. You've been collecting this for a long time. Yes, she said. Longer than the complaints. How? He asked. I listened, Denise said. I watched who got promoted. Who disappeared. Who suddenly needed performance coaching after speaking up. Jonathan's throat tightened. These aren't rumors, Denise continued. They're patterns. Corroborated. Jonathan finally picked up the drive. It felt heavier than it should have. This exposes people above Caleb, he said. Yes, Denise replied. And below him. It's not a ladder. It's a web. Jonathan leaned back. You know this could implicate me. Denise met his eyes. I know. Silence settled between them, thick but not hostile. I'm not asking you to protect me, Denise said. I'm asking you not to interfere. Jonathan nodded slowly. I won't. She studied him for a moment. You could still stop this. Jonathan shook his head. I shouldn't. Denise's shoulders eased slightly. There's something else, she said. Jonathan waited. I wasn't always planning to come forward, Denise admitted. I was planning to leave. Jonathan frowned. After the reports? Yes, she said. I had saved enough. I thought I could disappear. What changed? Jonathan asked. Denise looked down at her hands. The first time my access was restricted, I told myself it was an error. The second time, I knew it wasn't. The third time. She looked up. The third time, someone else was locked out too. Jonathan's pulse quickened. Who? A younger woman, Denise said. New. No savings. She waited outside for 2 hours before someone noticed. Jonathan closed his eyes. She cried when they let her back in, Denise continued. She kept apologizing. That's when I stopped thinking about escape. Jonathan felt a familiar heaviness return. So you stayed? Yes, Denise said. So someone would remember. Jonathan slid the flash drive into his jacket pocket. This will burn everything. Good, Denise replied softly. They stood together and walked toward the exit. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. At the door, Denise paused. If this turns against you, she said, I won't soften it. Jonathan nodded. I wouldn't ask you to. She opened the door. Cold air rushed in. As she stepped outside, Jonathan realized something unsettling. Denise hadn't come to him because she needed his power. She had come because she was finished being alone with the truth. And now neither of them could step back from what that truth was about to do. The hearings began quietly. No cameras at first. No headlines. Just sealed rooms, recorded testimony, and questions that peeled back years one decision at a time. Jonathan sat behind his legal team, hands folded, listening as names he recognized were read into the record. Some he'd mentored. Some he'd defended in boardrooms without knowing what he was defending them from. Denise testified on the second day. She didn't dramatize. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke the way people did when they had repeated the truth enough times that it no longer needed emphasis. Dates. Incidents. Patterns. When asked how she remembered so much, she answered simply, because I had to. Jonathan watched the panel members closely. The slight nods. The pauses in their writing. This was landing. Then it was his turn. Jonathan took the oath and sat under the lights, the room suddenly warmer than before. He felt the weight of expectation settle on him, not as a witness but as a symbol. Mr. Reed, one of the commissioners began, how would you describe your role in the oversight of employee welfare? Jonathan answered honestly. I believed in the systems we put in place. I believed they worked. And now, another asked. And now I know belief isn't oversight, Jonathan said. Presence is. There was no applause. Just silence, heavy and attentive. Emails surfaced. Audio clips. Internal memos Denise had preserved. Each one chipped away at the illusion of isolated misconduct. By the third day the press had caught wind. Headlines shifted from curiosity to reckoning. Former employees came forward. Stories echoed Denise's with different details but the same shape. Retaliation disguised as error. Discipline framed as policy. Jonathan issued another statement, shorter than the last. Accountability does not end at the top. It begins there. The board fractured soon after. Resignations followed. Some voluntary. Some not. Jonathan watched from the edge as the company he'd built began shedding the parts that had been protected for too long. Late one evening, Jonathan found himself alone in the same conference room where so many quiet decisions had been made. The long table reflected his tired face back at him. Elaine entered without knocking. They're calling it a turning point, she said. Jonathan didn't look up. They always do. They want to know if you'll stay, she continued, or step down. Jonathan considered the question. Staying isn't the same as leading, he said. Not anymore. Elaine nodded slowly. Across town, Denise sat in a community center surrounded by people she barely knew and somehow understood completely. Former employees. Advocates. A few reporters standing respectfully near the walls. When someone asked her what she planned to do next, she paused. I'm going to school, she said. Policy. Labor law. The room murmured with surprise. I don't want to tell stories forever, Denise continued. I want to change the rules. Jonathan watched the clip later that night, alone in his office. He replayed that line more than once. The final hearing ended without ceremony. Findings were issued. Reforms mandated. Oversight imposed from the outside. Jonathan signed the compliance agreements himself. As he left the building, reporters called his name. He stopped only once. This wasn't about one person, he said. And it wasn't about me. It was about what happens when people assume silence means consent. Denise stood a few steps away, unnoticed by most. Their eyes met briefly. No nod. No acknowledgement. Just shared understanding. Because both of them knew this wasn't redemption. It was consequence. And consequences, once set in motion, rarely stopped where anyone expected them to. The semester started in late August, when the heat still clung to the sidewalks and classrooms smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. Denise arrived early on her first day, sitting in the back row of a lecture hall that held more students than she'd expected. Most were younger. Some barely out of high school. They talked about internships and career paths with a confidence Denise recognized as unfamiliar territory. She took out a notebook, the same one she'd carried for years. Only now the pages were blank. Across town, Jonathan packed up his office. He didn't make a speech, didn't invite the board or the press. He placed books into boxes slowly, deliberately, pausing over notes scribbled in margins long before any of this had begun. Leadership he'd once written was about distance. Perspective. He closed the notebook. That afternoon, Denise raised her hand in class for the first time. When policy fails, she asked the professor, who notices first? The room fell quiet. The professor considered her carefully. Those closest to the impact, he replied. Denise nodded. She understood that. Jonathan handed in his resignation the following week. Not because he was forced, but because staying would have meant controlling a narrative that no longer belonged to him. He left quietly. The next months unfolded without ceremony. Denise balanced coursework with part-time work. Jonathan adjusted to a calendar with fewer meetings and more empty space. They crossed paths once by chance at a small coffee shop near the university. Jonathan recognized her first. "Denise," he said. She turned, surprised, then smiled. "Jonathan." They stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure how to exist outside the gravity of shared crisis. "How's school?" Jonathan asked. "Hard," she replied. "Worth it?" Jonathan nodded. "I imagine." They talked briefly. About classes. About the weather. About nothing that carried weight. Before leaving, Denise said, "They asked me to speak at an orientation." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "Listening," she said. "Before it becomes testimony." Jonathan smiled faintly. After she left, he sat with his coffee longer than planned, watching students hurry past with backpacks and headphones, futures still undefined. Denise walked back to campus, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Ownership. Not of a story. Of direction. Weeks later, Jonathan received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single-page letter. "Thank you for stepping aside when it mattered." No signature. Jonathan folded it carefully and placed it on his desk. Denise stood at a podium a month later, addressing a room full of new students. She didn't tell them her story. She didn't need to. She spoke about systems. About power. About how change rarely started with confidence. It started with discomfort. As applause filled the room, Denise realized she wasn't being defined by what had happened to her. She was defining what would happen next. And somewhere beyond the applause, consequences were still unfolding, quietly reshaping the ground beneath people who had once believed they were untouchable. Winter returned quietly. Not with drama, not with storms that made headlines, but with the kind of cold that settled in slowly and stayed. Jonathan noticed it the morning he drove back to the estate for the first time in months. The house no longer felt like a command center. No assistants. No rotating staff. Just a caretaker and silence. He parked near the service entrance. The stone wall was still there. Jonathan stood in the cold for a long time, hands in his coat pockets, staring at the place where everything had come into focus. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the ground was hard and pale, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs. He remembered how ordinary that night had felt before it broke open. The decision came without ceremony. 2 days later, construction trucks arrived. There was no announcement. No explanation posted. Just workers measuring, marking, and then dismantling the wall piece by piece. Stone scraped against stone. Dust settled where certainty once stood. Neighbors asked questions. Jonathan gave simple answers. It's no longer needed. By the end of the week, the entrance was open. Unremarkable. Passable. Like it should have been all along. Denise saw a photo of it online. Someone had posted it casually, almost without context. A comment beneath it read, "Didn't even know there used to be a wall there." She stared at the image longer than she expected. Later that evening, she closed her laptop and returned to her reading. Case studies. Policy drafts. Margins filled with notes in her careful handwriting. Her life was full now. Not easy, but anchored. Jonathan's days had slowed. He volunteered quietly, attended meetings where he listened more than he spoke. When people recognized him, they didn't ask for explanations anymore. They asked what he was doing next. He never gave a grand answer. "I'm paying attention," he said. Months later, Denise received her first internship offer. Unpaid. Competitive. Exactly what she wanted. She walked across campus afterward, phone pressed to her ear, laughing softly as she told someone the news. She passed a maintenance worker clearing snow near the steps and stopped to help, holding a door, sharing a brief smile. Small things mattered differently now. Jonathan stood at the open entrance one last time before leaving the property for good. The space where the wall had been felt exposed but honest. He realized something then. Change didn't arrive with speeches or sudden forgiveness. It arrived when barriers stopped pretending they were protection, and accountability stopped waiting for permission. If you stayed with this story until the end, you understand something most people never see until it's too late. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe quiet choices can reshape entire lives, take a moment to like this story, subscribe for more, and share where you're listening from. Your presence here is part of why stories like this keep getting told.